All right, let's go. Number 10. In the spring of 430 BCE, a disease no one could name arrived in Athens through the port of Piraeus. The city was packed past capacity. Pericles, the architect of Athenian democracy, had ordered the rural population inside the long walls to wait out the Spartan invasion. It was supposed to be a strategy of patience. Instead, it became a trap. Thucydides, an eyewitness who caught the disease and survived, wrote down what he saw with the cold precision of a man documenting his own species failing. Fever. Bloodshot eyes. Internal burning so intense that victims threw themselves into wells and cisterns just to feel cool water against skin that felt like it was on fire. Here is the scale of what this actually did. Modern estimates put the death toll at 1/4 to 1/3 of the Athenian population. Not soldiers falling to swords, citizens dissolving from the inside, in their own homes, in a city too crowded to bury them properly. Pericles himself died from it in 429 BCE, and with him went the steady hand that had held the Athenian war effort together. Some historians argue the plague didn't just weaken Athens, it changed the entire outcome of the Peloponnesian War, tipping the balance of Greek civilization away from Athenian democracy and toward Spartan militarism, a hinge point that arguably reshaped the trajectory of Western political history. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Despite 2,500 years of forensic guesswork, no one has definitively identified the pathogen. Typhoid fever, typhus, measles, smallpox, even a hemorrhagic viral fever similar to Ebola have all been proposed. In 2006, researchers extracted dental pulp from a mass grave beneath the Kerameikos Cemetery and found DNA fragments resembling Salmonella enterica, the bacteria behind typhoid. Other teams have disputed the sample as contaminated. The truth is, we still do not know exactly what walked into Athens in 430 BCE, only that it was efficient enough to help decide the fate of Greek civilization, and then vanish so completely that its exact genetic signature remains locked in unresolved argument. What's left now is a mass grave under a modern cemetery in Athens, teeth holding fragments of an organism science still cannot name with certainty, and a historian's account so vivid it reads like a warning letter from a plague that never told us who it was. Alright, number 9. In 165 CE, Roman legions returning from a campaign against the Parthian Empire in Mesopotamia brought something home that no Eastern battle could match for lethality. Named after the reigning imperial family, the Antonine Plague spread along Rome's own infrastructure. The roads and shipping lanes built to project power now became conduits for its collapse. The physician Galen documented the symptoms directly, describing fever, black diarrhea, and a rash of pustules that covered the entire body by day 9, a description close enough to smallpox that most modern epidemiologists accept the diagnosis. Here is the scale of what this actually meant. Estimates place the death toll near 5 million people across the empire, roughly 10% of the entire Roman population at its height. This was the first pandemic in recorded history with a description precise enough to be identified with a specific modern disease. It didn't just kill civilians, it gutted the legions. Roman military recruitment shifted permanently after the outbreak, with the empire increasingly relying on Germanic auxiliary troops to fill the ranks that plague had emptied. A demographic shift that historians tied directly to the empire's later vulnerability along its northern frontier. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. This wasn't a single wave. Ancient sources describe the plague recurring for over 20 years, grinding through generations, weakening imperial tax revenue, military strength, and administrative continuity simultaneously. Some historians now argue the Antonine Plague marks the actual beginning of Rome's long decline, centuries before the sack of any city. The fall triggered not by barbarians at the gate, but by a virus riding home in a soldier's blood. What's left now is Galen's clinical notes, still legible after nearly 2,000 years, and a demographic scar in the Roman military record that historians read as the first real crack in an empire that believed itself eternal. Alright, number 8. In 249 CE, a bishop named Cyprian in Carthage began describing a disease so relentless that Roman citizens started to believe the world itself was ending. The Plague of Cyprian, named after the churchman who chronicled it because Roman administrators were too overwhelmed to keep proper records, moved through the empire for over a decade. Cyprian's own account describes bowels dissolving in constant flux, throats set on fire with continual ulceration, eyes clouded by the infection's vapors, and limbs amputating themselves through the corruption of diseased matter. Here is the scale of what this actually did. At its peak, the epidemic reportedly killed 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. Entire towns emptied. Roman coinage from this period shows a measurable debasement in silver content, a direct economic fingerprint of an empire that could no longer function at full capacity. Harvests failed because there weren't enough hands left to work the fields. This is now recognized by many historians as a central driver of the crisis of the 3rd century, the near collapse of Roman central authority that saw the empire briefly fracture into 3 competing states. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Cyprian didn't just document the horror. He used it as theology, arguing that Christians should welcome death from plague as liberation from a wicked world, a message that reframed mass death as spiritual opportunity. Historians now argue this psychological reframing, delivered while pagan Rome had no equivalent framework to explain mass suffering, is one of the underappreciated accelerants behind the rapid spread of Christianity through the collapsing empire. A disease no one could identify may have done more to convert Rome than any army of missionaries. What's left now is Cyprian's own sermon, written from inside a dying city, still read today as both a medical record and the opening argument for a religious transformation that would remake the Western world. All right, number 7. In the 1340s, a pathogen now identified as Yersinia pestis moved out of Central Asia along the Silk Road and into a Europe with zero biological preparation. The Black Death is the most famous epidemic in human history, and its story doesn't end with the 14th century. It ends inside the genome of people alive right now. Here is the scale of what this actually left behind. Roughly 1/3 to half of the European population died within a few catastrophic years. But the survivors weren't random. Population geneticists studying modern European DNA identified a mutation called CCR5 delta 32, a small deletion in a gene that codes for a receptor on the surface of immune cells. This mutation is dramatically more common in European populations descended from Black Death survivor regions than anywhere else on Earth. A genetic signature carved directly by a medieval catastrophe. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. That same mutation, selected for because it may have offered some resistance advantage during centuries of plague exposure, turns out to block the exact receptor that HIV uses to enter human cells. People who carry 2 copies of CCR5 delta 32 are functionally immune to most strains of HIV, a defense mechanism forged in the horror of the Black Death, buried silently in European genomes for 6 centuries, turned out to be a shield against a virus that wouldn't exist for another 600 years. Your body may be carrying armor built for a war you never knew was fought. What's left now is the mutation itself, sitting quietly in millions of chromosomes, a message written into human DNA by a pandemic that ended in 1353, but never actually stopped shaping who survives and who doesn't. All right, number 6. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's ships crossed an ocean that had kept 2 hemispheres biologically separated for over 10,000 years. What followed wasn't conquest in the way it's usually taught. It was the single most catastrophic demographic collapse ever documented on Earth. Here is the scale of what this actually did. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus tore through populations in the Americas that had no prior exposure and therefore no inherited immune defense whatsoever. Estimates of population loss across the Americas in the century following contact range as high as 90%. Entire civilizations, cities, languages, and belief systems didn't decline. They were erased before European colonizers had even finished mapping the coastlines. Some researchers argue this depopulation was so massive and so fast that the resulting regrowth of forests across the abandoned Americas pulled enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to contribute to a measurable global cooling event now visible in ice core records, a phenomenon some scientists call the Orbis spike. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. This wasn't the result of a single epidemic wave. It was a cascading, multi-generational collapse. One disease weakening survivors just enough for the next one to finish the job. Decade after decade, across a landmass home to tens of millions of people. Entire nations vanished, not from war, but from pathogens that arrived quietly, invisibly, ahead of the soldiers who would later be credited with their fall. What's left now is a demographic wound so large it altered planetary carbon chemistry, and a historical record still struggling to fully name a catastrophe that erased more human beings than any war in recorded history. All right, number 5. In 735 CE, an outbreak of smallpox began moving through Japan, likely carried by a diplomatic mission returning from the Korean peninsula. Over the following 2 years, the disease burned through the Japanese archipelago with a speed that overwhelmed the imperial court in Nara. Here is the scale of what this actually did. Modern estimates suggest the epidemic killed roughly a third of Japan's entire population, including 4 powerful brothers of the Fujiwara clan who died within months of each other, a political decapitation that reshaped the balance of power at the imperial court. Rice paddies went unworked. Tax registers from the period show entire villages disappearing from administrative records, not relocated, simply gone. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Emperor Shomu, watching his empire disintegrate under a disease he had no way to fight, responded not with medicine, but with theology. He ordered the construction of provincial temples across the country and commissioned the great Buddha at Todaiji, one of the largest bronze statues ever cast, as a spiritual defense against a plague no army could face. State Buddhism in Japan, still visible today in its temple architecture and religious infrastructure, was permanently reoriented by a government that had run out of earthly solutions and turned toward a national religious project as its final response to biological catastrophe. What's left now is the great Buddha of Nara, still standing, cast in bronze by an empire that built a monument the size of a nightmare because a virus had made it clear that swords and armies meant nothing against it. All right, number 4. In 1485, 5 days after Henry Tudor's forces won the crown of England at Bosworth Field, a new disease appeared in London that killed with a speed unlike anything physicians had ever recorded. The sweating sickness, or Sutor anglicus, could kill a healthy person within hours of the first symptom. Victims described sudden intense heat, uncontrollable sweating, and a crushing sense of dread moments before collapse. Here is the scale of what this actually did. 5 distinct epidemic waves swept through England, and, in its final outbreak, continental Europe between 1485 and 1551. Mortality rates in some outbreaks reached 50% of those infected, and death could arrive within 3 to 18 hours of the first symptom, a speed that left almost no time for treatment, confession, or even a final letter home. Entire households collapsed in a single night. The disease seemed to specifically target the wealthy and the healthy, sparing the poor and the already sick in a pattern that terrified contemporary physicians who could find no explanation. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. After the final outbreak in 1551, the sweating sickness vanished completely from the historical record and has never reappeared. Not once in over 470 years. No pathogen has ever been conclusively identified. Hantavirus, a now extinct strain of influenza, and a form of relapsing fever have all been proposed, and none fully fit the clinical description. Something killed thousands of people in a matter of hours, repeatedly, for 66 years, and then simply stopped existing on Earth, its genetic identity gone with it. What's left now is a set of physicians' letters describing a killer that arrived without warning and left without explanation. A disease with no known cause, no known cure, and no known reason for its own disappearance. All right, number 3. In 1545, an epidemic began in the Valley of Mexico that colonial Spanish administrators recorded under the Nahuatl word Cocoliztli, meaning pestilence. This wasn't smallpox. Survivors and victims of earlier epidemics both fell to this new disease, meaning prior immunity offered no protection whatsoever, a signature that told colonial physicians they were dealing with something entirely new. Here is the scale of what this actually did. Contemporary estimates suggest the 1545 outbreak alone killed somewhere between 5 and 15 million people, in a population already devastated by decades of prior epidemics. Victims suffered high fever, severe headache, black tongue, dark urine, and hemorrhaging from the nose, and death often followed within days. For nearly 500 years, the exact cause remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of colonial epidemiology. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. In 2018, researchers extracting ancient DNA from teeth in a Cocoliztli burial site identified genetic traces of Salmonella enterica, specifically a strain called paratyphi C, a form of enteric fever related to typhoid. This means a bacterial disease likely introduced or amplified by the ecological chaos of colonization and drought may have killed more people in a single valley than most wars in human history. And its exact genetic fingerprint sat undiscovered in human teeth for 473 years before modern sequencing technology finally gave it a name. What's left now is bacterial DNA, recovered from the teeth of the dead. A genome that waited nearly 5 centuries in the ground before science could finally read the name of the thing that erased so many lives in colonial Mexico.
All right, number 2. In late 1889, a new respiratory illness emerged, first reported in the Russian Empire, specifically in cities along the path of the newly completed Trans-Siberian Rail Network. And then, it did something no disease had ever done before. It circled the entire planet in under 4 months, using the newly interconnected global railway and steamship networks as its transmission system. Here is the scale of what this actually did. The Russian flu of 1889 to 1890 is generally credited as the first true pandemic of the industrial era, killing an estimated 1 million people worldwide at a time when global population was a fraction of today's, and demonstrating for the first time that modern infrastructure could turn a regional outbreak into a planetary event within a single season. It was called the first pandemic of the modern age of transportation, a preview of exactly what industrialized humanity had built the capacity to unleash on itself. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. For over a century, the Russian flu was assumed to be an influenza strain. Recent genetic and epidemiological analysis, however, has proposed an entirely different suspect, a human coronavirus, specifically one closely related to OC43, which still circulates today as a cause of the common cold. If this identification holds, it means the first pandemic in world history that traveled the globe using industrial transportation may not have been an influenza virus at all, but a coronavirus, the same viral family behind more recent global outbreaks, quietly rehearsing a global takeover more than a century before the world would face one again. What's left now is a century-old mystery still being re-argued by virologists, and a haunting possibility that the modern world's first true pandemic was a coronavirus we simply misdiagnosed for over 100 years.
All right, number 1. Carved into an Egyptian stele from roughly 1400 BCE, now held in the Nie Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, is the image of a temple priest named Ruma. His right leg is withered and shortened, foot dropped in a specific deformity, and he leans on a staff for support. Physicians who have studied the carving for over a century have concluded it depicts one of the earliest visual records of poliomyelitis, paralysis, in human history, more than 3,000 years before the disease became a defining terror of the 20th century. Here's the scale of what this actually means. Polio isn't a modern disease that appeared from nowhere in the 1900s and then was defeated by science within a few decades. Genetic and paleopathological research has identified evidence consistent with poliovirus infection reaching back through Egyptian antiquity, and further genomic work has found signatures suggesting related pathogens circulated in populations stretching back into the deep past, including evidence recovered from Neanderthal remains, a version of a disease humanity has apparently been fighting since before our own species finished evolving. But here's where the nightmare truly begins. Polio's ancient presence means the 20th century epidemic wasn't a new threat. It was an old one, finally given the perfect conditions to explode. Improved sanitation in industrializing cities, ironically, delayed childhood exposure to the virus, meaning children encountered it later in life, when the disease is far more likely to cause paralysis rather than a mild, immunity-building infection in infancy. Humanity's own progress in hygiene inadvertently primed one of its oldest biological companions to become one of its most feared modern killers, a pathogen that had been quietly riding alongside our species since before recorded history, waiting for civilization itself to hand it a more dangerous foothold. What's left now is a 3,400-year-old stone carving of a paralyzed man's leg, sitting in a museum case in Copenhagen, Proof that one of the diseases we thought we understood has been walking beside our species since before the pyramids were finished, and that our own progress was the very thing that gave it new teeth. 10 diseases, 10 different centuries, but they all point at the same uncomfortable truth. Every plague in this list didn't just kill, it rewrote something permanent. A genome, a religion, a political order, a demographic map of an entire hemisphere. The mutation protecting you from HIV was forged in medieval terror you never lived through.
The virus that may have quietly conquered the planet in 1889 might still be causing your common cold today. And the disease we thought was purely modern was carved into stone by a temple priest 3,500 years before anyone gave it a name. History likes to tell itself as armies and kings and empires. But underneath every one of those stories is a smaller, quieter narrative, written not in ink, but in DNA. And it has been rewriting us since long before we learned how to read it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.